I got in! Oh!
Yeah! I got in! I got in!
I recently got admitted to the London Business School MBA program with a scholarship, and my background isn't the typical MBA profile. I'm a medical doctor, and I didn't study business. I didn't come from consulting, finance, or a traditional corporate career. So, in this video, I'm going to break down exactly how I got into one of the best business schools in the entire world. I'll walk you through the profile I applied with, my career story, how I presented my application, and how I structured my essays. Stick around because by the end of the video, I run through some of the biggest weaknesses in my application, and I'll tell you exactly how I addressed them during the process. So first, let me introduce myself. Hi, I'm Matthew Lee. I'm a former medical doctor from Kingston, Jamaica, and I transitioned into healthcare marketing after moving to the UK to do my master's degree. So if you're thinking about applying to top MBA programs, especially if you're coming from a non-traditional background, understanding how an application actually comes together can make the whole process much clearer. So rather than speaking in general terms, I'm going to walk through my own application step by step. And if you're interested in MBA applications, career transitions, and want to follow my journey at London Business School, please consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's start with the profile I applied with. Chapter 1, my MBA profile. So before we talk about the essays or the strategy behind the application, it's really important to understand the profile I actually applied with. So MBA admissions are always evaluated in context. Schools look back at your academic record, your test scores, work experience, and leadership outside of work. So in this section, I'll quickly walk you through the profile I submitted when I applied to London Business School. Let's start with my academic background. So for my undergraduate degree in medicine, my GPA was actually very low. It was below 3.0, and this was on a 4.0 GPA scale. And initially, I thought this would have made my business school chances really low. However, I did complete a master's in management in the UK, where I achieved a perfect 4.0 GPA and graduated with distinction. So while my undergraduate GPA was relatively weak, I felt my master's performance really helped demonstrate my academic ability more clearly. I'll talk a bit more about how I addressed this later on in the video when I discuss the weaknesses in my application. GRE and GMAT test scores. So next up was the test scores, and I chose the GRE instead of the GMAT because when I did my diagnostic tests, my scores were slightly higher on the GRE, and I felt that the quantitative section really suited me more on GRE. In total, I ended up taking the GRE 2 times, and the first time I scored well below my target. My target was to achieve a 160 in both sections. So instead of feeling bad for myself, I studied again for another 2 months and retook the exam. And without sharing the exact number, because comparison is the thief of joy, I did end up scoring above the median score for London Business School. So I felt my scores were strong enough to be competitive, but it definitely wasn't one of those extremely high scores that you sometimes see on the forums. So I would say that my test scores were good enough for most top business school MBA programs, but it was nothing extraordinary. Work experience. So in terms of work experience, I had around 4 to 5 years of professional experience when I applied. So this included my early clinical years working as a doctor in Jamaica, around 1.5 years working in healthcare marketing with family brands in Jamaica, and then roughly 3 years in my current role at a health tech startup. So overall, I had experience across clinical medicine, marketing, and health tech, as well as exposure to the Caribbean and UK healthcare systems. So in general, top business schools usually have candidates with around 5 years work experience post-graduation. So for me, I think this combination of varied experience and international exposure was one of the stronger aspects of my application. Leadership and extracurriculars. So another really important part of the application is demonstrating your leadership and extracurricular activities. So for me, on the leadership side, I was actively involved with the Chinese Benevolent Association in Jamaica, and there I served as a member on the council. And for me, this was really important in some of the essays where I spoke about growing up Chinese Jamaican, so that part was really helpful for me. But where I think I had a particularly strong advantage was in my sporting. So I've been a national badminton athlete since childhood, and I represented Jamaica internationally since then. At one point, I had a World Junior ranking within the the top 100. And in 2019, I was awarded the National Badminton Player of the Year in Jamaica. So through badminton, I gained a lot of international exposure and leadership experience. And I think this really helped strengthen my overall profile and really provided something different on my application. Chapter 2, my career story. So now that you understand the profile I applied with, the next and arguably the most important part of the application is the career story. So top MBA programs aren't just evaluating your statistics. They want to understand why you've made the decisions you've made in your career and where you're going next. So for both my essays and interview process, the most important thing that I had to explain was my career narrative. So to summarize it, I had to explain why I studied medicine, why I eventually decided to step away from clinical medicine, why I pursued my previous master's degree, and how that ultimately led me to pursue an MBA. If you want the full story behind my transition out of medicine, I actually made another video explaining that journey in detail. But to summarize it briefly, my core motivation has always been to create a larger impact in healthcare. And while working as a doctor in the hospital, I realized that the impact of a single clinician is really important, but really limited by scale. And when I moved into the health tech startup space in the UK, I had to make sure they knew that that transition was really intentional. I started to work on huge projects targeting chronic diseases, and that affected prevention on a population level. So this was now affecting thousands or millions of people, rather than me just seeing one individual patient. So that experience made me realize that I really wanted to work closer with the mix of healthcare, business, and innovation. And that's what ultimately led me to pursue an MBA. Why now for the MBA? So after working both as a doctor and later within a health tech startup, I reached a point where I realized that if I wanted to work at the intersection of healthcare, business, and innovation, I would need a different set of tools. And that's sort of where the MBA became the next logical step. And I felt like this was the right point in my career to pursue it for a few reasons. So first, I wanted to build a stronger network within the business and healthcare innovation ecosystem, especially among people working in consulting, venture capital, and health tech. Second, I really wanted to develop hard business skills that I didn't receive during my clinical training. So I wanted to do things like learn how strategy works, how to read financial statements, and how organizations make large-scale decisions. And then finally, probably the most important thing was that the MBA already directly aligned with my short-term and long-term career goals that I already had started developing. And these goals ultimately became the foundation to how I structured my essays, which I'll explain in the next section. Chapter 3, my essays. Now, the essays are really where the entire application comes together. So up to this point, the admissions team has seen your profile, your academics, your test scores, your work experience, and your extracurriculars. But the essays is the part where you actually get to explain how all of these pieces of your application come together. So there are a few things that top MBA programs, including London Business School, are essentially trying to understand. First, they're trying to understand what your short-term career goals are, what your long-term ambitions are, why do you think you need an MBA to achieve these goals, why now in your career, and why at this specific school. So essentially, these essays are really about presenting a clear and logical narrative that connects your past experience to your future plans. Career goals essay. So for my career goals essay, I explained that my short-term goal after the MBA is to move into healthcare consulting, specifically at the MBB firms. And I had to explain why consulting made sense as the next step in my career. So I explained that consulting would allow me to develop the structured problem-solving skills, gain exposure to multiple healthcare organizations, and understand how large healthcare systems and companies operate at a large scale. I then explained that this experience would then prepare me for my long-term goal, which is to move into healthcare venture capital. Because I've had experience working within hospitals and within a health tech startups, I was very interested in how healthcare startups are evaluated, funded, and scaled. So I made it clear that my long-term ambition was to work on the investment side of healthcare innovation. I let them know that I wanted to direct capital towards companies that can improve healthcare outcomes. How I structured the essays. So in terms of structure, I built the essays around a really simple framework. So first I explained my past experiences. Studying medicine and then working in health tech, I then had to explain how these past experiences shaped my current career goals. After that, I explained why the MBA was necessary to bridge this gap between where I was and where I wanted to go. And finally, I had to explain specifically why London Business School was the right place to pursue these goals. So essentially, these essays were about connecting my medical background, startup experience, and long-term ambitions in healthcare into one coherent story. And if you're interested in seeing the full essay that I used to get into the London Business School MBA, let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to share it and break it down step by step in a separate video. Chapter 4. Weaknesses in my application. So like most applicants, my application definitely had a few weaknesses. And this is important to understand about MBA applications. Admissions committees aren't expecting a perfect profile. Almost every candidate has something in their background that needs a bit of context. And I think what matters most is how clearly and honestly you address these weaknesses. So this is where the optional essays and short answer sections of the application become very important. These sections allow you to explain anything in your profile that might otherwise raise questions for the admissions team. For me, there were 3 main weaknesses that I needed to address. Low undergraduate GPA. So the first was my undergraduate GPA during medical school, which was relatively low. And you might be wondering why the undergraduate GPA even matters. But the MBA admissions use this GPA as one of the main indicators to evaluate your academic readiness for the program. Essentially, they want to make sure that you can at least handle the coursework. So in my optional essay, I had to address this clearly. So I explained that while my performance during medical school wasn't particularly strong, my later academic performance in my master's was a much better reflection of my academic ability. So specifically, I highlighted that in my master's in management, I graduated with a distinction and a perfect GPA. So that helped me demonstrate that when I was studying in an environment that sort of aligned more closely with my interest and learning style, I was capable of performing at the highest academic level. So the key here was acknowledging the weakness without making excuses, and then providing evidence on how I improved on that weakness already. Letter of recommendation from a non-current supervisor. So another challenge was my letter of recommendation. Most MBA programs prefer recommendations from your current direct supervisor. This is because that person can usually provide the most accurate assessment of your professional performance. However, at the time of applying, I was on a working visa, which made it really difficult to request a letter of recommendation from my current employer. And this was really unfortunate for me because at the time, my direct supervisor was actually the CEO of the startup. So instead, I had to request a letter of recommendation from a former direct supervisor during my time in clinical medicine. And for schools that needed 2, I had to request another recommendation from my experience doing national badminton from the Jamaica Badminton Association. Luckily, both of these individuals had observed my leadership, work ethic, and performance closely over time, but situations like this are actually quite common in MBA applications. The admissions teams understand that there are legitimate reasons why somebody might not request a letter of recommendation from their current employer. The key here is to simply explain the situation clearly in the application, which is exactly what I did. Career gap. So the third issue I needed to address was a 6-month career gap. So after graduating from medicine, I had to take some time away from work due to health reasons. So again, the approach here is just to simply explain the situation clearly. In the application, I outlined what happened, how I used that time to recover and reflect, and what I learned from that experience. So admissions teams generally understand that career gap can happen for many reasons, whether that's health, family, personal responsibilities, or specific circumstances. And what matters most is that you acknowledge the gap honestly, provide context rather than leaving it unexplained. So while my application certainly had a few weaknesses, I just focused on addressing each of them clearly and directly within the application space. And overall, the combination of my career story, my essays, and broader profile helped strengthen my application despite these challenges. As you can see, getting into a top MBA program isn't just about having the perfect stats. It's really about how your profile, career story, and future goals all come together in one clear narrative. In my case, this meant connecting my background in medicine, my experience working in health tech, and my long-term goal of working in healthcare innovation. And even though my application had a few weaknesses, addressing them directly in the application made a huge difference. So, if you're interested in MBA applications, career transitions, or you just want to follow my journey at London Business School, please consider subscribing to the channel. Over the next couple of months, I'll be documenting the entire experience, from starting the program to recruiting, internships, and what the MBA experience really is like. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.